As the climate crisis deepens, environmental activists have been testing the limits of peaceful protest. Brazen acts of civil disobedience, some disrupting critical parts of the nation's infrastructure, have prompted a growing debate over eco-extremism and domestic terror and the fine line between them. Tonight, we're taking a closer look at the case of an Iowa woman who set out to fight an oil pipeline, but she's now in prison fighting a sentence for terrorism. The government says she posed a major threat. She says the punishment doesn't fit the crime. Our Devin Dwyer has the story.
The dramatic stunts have shut down major oil shipping routes, caused rush hour chaos in major cities, and left smoldering scenes of property destruction, all in the name of protecting the environment.
It's dangerous, it harms people, and it's illegal.
To some, they're dramatic acts of protest. To others, brazen acts of domestic terrorism.
It's the certain kind of crime, usually a violent crime, coupled with this idea that there's some political motive.
The fight against climate change giving rise to so-called eco-extremism and a growing debate over free speech and law and order.
Let me hear you scream.
Erupting in 2016 in remote North Dakota, where thousands of native and environmental activists staged protests against the Dakota Access oil pipeline, running from North Dakota to Illinois. Jessica Resnicek was among them.
The Dakota Access pipeline is an issue that affects this entire nation.
Raised Catholic on a small farm in Iowa, Resnicek told ABC affiliate WOI that she felt a spiritual calling to fight the pipeline and to do it with more than just banners and bullhorns.
We're just like witnessing these industries destroying life around us, and for what?
With a fellow activist, Resnicek conspired in 2016 and 2017 to damage the pipeline with a blowtorch, according to court documents, cutting holes in at least 3 sections across several counties and setting fire to multiple construction vehicles.
Whether you agree with the pipeline or not, it's still private property. You can't damage other people's private property.
She never hurt or killed anyone and says she never targeted human life, but federal authorities said tampering with an active pipeline had potentially catastrophic consequences for national security, in addition to causing more than $3 million in damage. Prosecutors secured a guilty plea from Resnicek on one felony count of conspiracy to damage an energy facility.
I entered the valve site multiple times and multiple locations on multiple days.
Fully expecting prison time, but stunned when the government sought an enhanced sentence for domestic terrorism.
She was never charged with terrorism. She didn't plead guilty to terrorism.
What was sort of your expectation on that day?
It was somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 to 4 years.
The terrorism enhancement effectively doubled Resnicek's sentence to 8 years in prison.
It's also troubling for lots of other people who are involved in protest, environmental, nuclear, civil rights, Black Lives Matter, and others that see this as a really hyper-criminalization of consequences for people who protest.
The hardline approach gained steam after the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing, when Congress enacted tougher penalties to intentionally deter violent acts of intimidation or coercion aimed at the government or civilian population.
When an individual or group of individuals engage in acts of targeted violence, and they should expect, regardless of how noble their cause, that they will be investigated, arrested, prosecuted, and if convicted, incarcerated.
As terrorists.
As terrorists.
But critics say the law is too broad and inconsistently applied.
Let's not dilute it by applying it to everybody who does any trespass or any property damage.
Civil rights groups say prosecutors and judges have increasingly branded eco-saboteurs as terrorists, even as they sometimes resist that label in other, more violent cases.
I believe 100% that this is an overreach of power, and it is absolutely imperative that we put guidelines in place.
Senator Ed Markey and other climate advocates say the oil and gas industry is trying to silence opposition.
My name is Gavin Kreidler. I appear before you today representing the American fuel and petrochemical manufacturers.
Spending years lobbying state and federal lawmakers to enact tougher rules for protesters.
You can scream and holler all you want,
but just don't go out there and tear things up and start messing with facilities.
Increasing penalties for trespass, damage, or destruction at critical infrastructure sites. In the last 5 years, 17 states have adopted so-called critical infrastructure protection laws, which do just that.
These laws introduce extraordinary penalties. So protesters who even momentarily cross onto property that contains a pipeline can now face multiple years in prison. They're discouraging people from turning out and making their voices heard.
In 2017, 84 members of Congress, Republicans and Democrats, who received a combined $36 million in campaign contributions from the oil and gas industry, pressed the Justice Department to treat all eco-saboteurs as domestic terrorists. The Department of Homeland Security later grouping some environmental activists, so-called pipeline valve turners, with mass killers and white supremacists, according to internal documents reviewed by ABC.
What the oil and gas industry want is for these protesters to be charged as eco-terrorists so that they are sentenced to longer time in prison as a deterrent against legitimate civil disobedience. And that's wrong.
Terrorism sentences have historically been applied to defendants with ties to ISIS or al-Qaeda, or violent domestic extremists like Cesar Sayoc, convicted in 2018 for mailing pipe bombs to members of Congress. But notably, prosecutors did not seek terrorism enhancements for Dylan Roof, who massacred 9 people at a Charleston Bible study, or James Fields, who attacked Charlottesville demonstrators with his car.
Ultimately, you're never going to get a system where it's uniformly applied everywhere.
Of the 140 defendants sentenced in connection with the January 6th Capitol insurrection, vocally targeting members of Congress, none have faced terrorism charges or sentences.
Unfortunately, under our current legal environment, it may not meet the elements of a terrorism offense.
Jessica Resnicek, now in her first year behind bars, is appealing the terrorism enhancement of her sentence in federal court next month. The Justice Department insisting it should stay in place and that the evidence shows her conduct was targeting the government.
It's going to be a difficult uphill battle for her. But if she is able to make that distinction, it would be a very significant one in how these cases are approached.
A, how optimistic are you you'll succeed? And B, if she does prevail, what message will that send?
I am always hopeful that justice will prevail. And I think justice is on the side of, yes, she spends some time in prison, but she is not a terrorist.
That's Devin Dwyer reporting.
Hi everyone, George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch live event coverage, click on the right over here to subscribe to our channel, and don't forget to download the ABC News app for breaking news alerts. Thanks for watching.